you know, Warhol began as a commercial illustrator, and he just didn't see anything wrong with making beautiful drawings. Of course, his contemporaries, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, at the same time that they were making their, you know, their revolutionary statements in the fine arts, were also supporting themselves as working under a pseudonym as commercial illustrators. But for them, it was something to be kept at a distance. It was something to be ashamed of. And whereas Warhol never saw that there was anything to be ashamed of in that. And at the same time, when Warhol began making his pop canvases and really introduced what I think is, you know, his single most important formal innovation, the marriage of photography and painting, it was really out of a certain kind of American pragmatism. I mean, why go to the trouble of making a drawing of Jackie Kennedy based on a photograph when you can just take something that's already great, a photograph, and superimpose it on, the, you know, having whatever colors you want on a canvas. And what I mean to say is that he didn't have this bourgeois attachment to craft. If you could make something beautiful that way, then there was no reason to, you know, to assume that the work would be any less valuable aesthetically or, you know, economically than a work that someone like, you know, Jackson Pollock worked on, or Willem de Kooning is the famous example of someone who lived in a garret for a year working on and destroying and remaking the same painting. So I think it's interesting to regard Warhol as someone who went sort of straight from the bottom to the top, and while he played to a middle-class audience, you know, in the manner of Salvador Dali, he never really, I don't think that he ever completely identified with it. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Interestingly, I think that notion of a middle-class audience was probably the first, and probably even today, the one that is the most problematic. When many visitors come to my museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is in pretty much the center of the United States, they wonder why would anyone paint a soup can for a very, very important work of art? Why would one paint Marilyn Monroe? And yet when I talk to these people, I'll say, well, if you look at the Campbell soup can or the Coca-Cola bottle or the packages of Brillo pads or of tomato juice, I said, what would you call that in academic traditional art? And people look at me and I said, well, a still life. If you look at a still life, I just saw the other day, a beautiful still life by Fernando Botero in the museum just here around the corner. That's a still life of fruit, papayas and guavas that you might see here indigenously in Colombia. And Coca-Cola back then was sort of what people were eating every day. And if you painted Marilyn Monroe, that was because for modern society, Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley was far more relevant than a picture of the Blessed Virgin or a picture of a noble Senator George Washington or something of that nature. For our modern culture, if I said, if everyone raised their hands and say, who is your most important movie star today? What music are you listening to? And those would be all the people that if Warhol was here today, he would be painting. And he said one time, if you want to be successful, and by this he meant both financially successful, but also critically successful, find out what people want, and then work towards that. Find out who their models are, find out what is attractive to them, find out what they would like to be, especially if they've come from a farm or worked, their parents and grandparents worked in a factory, as Warhol's did. Find out, and then they will want that picture of Marilyn Monroe because everyone desired her, both men and women. Women perhaps for her beauty and men for her sexuality. And in point of fact, when you go to the exhibition and look at Marilyn Monroe, something that I always tell people to think about is Warhol is telling you in those pictures, yes, everyone knew who Marilyn Monroe was, liked her movies, but that she, like Warhol, but becomes a work of art because she was a real woman whose name was Norma Jean Baker. She lived on a farm, and although she was very beautiful and had some talent, when she came to Hollywood, they fixed her up. They dyed her hair blonde, she had breast enhancements, she had a vocal coach, someone dressed her in couturier dresses and jewelry. And then a movie mogul from one of the studios said, Norma Jean Baker, that's not a movie star's name. Marilyn Monroe, that's a movie star's name. So that she herself becomes a work of art. And that what you see, which is both tragic and wonderful in the pictures, you can look at them and say, oh, Marilyn, I'd love to look like that. I'd love to be a movie star and have famous boyfriends who were baseball players and whatever. But then you see, if you look closer at the pictures, they start falling apart. And as we know, Marilyn Monroe took drugs to go to sleep at night, to get up in the morning, and died perhaps at her own hand of drug abuse because Norma Jean Baker, the real person, couldn't exist with all the pressures to be Marilyn Monroe. And I ask you just to think about a year ago when the pop singer Britney Spears, whether you think she's talented or not, I think she isn't, but when she, from the pressures, shaved her head off. She could not, as this young girl, deal with millions of people trying to sort of make her do something. And Warhol was saying, the American dream can also be the American nightmare.
I think that's why a lot of his, the celebrity portraits have a very clear dark side. Tom talks about the Marilyn Monroe paintings. Well, Warhol began making them, I think, the day after she committed suicide. The Jackie canvases are at least the most famous Jackie series, 8 of which we have in the show, were begun after the Kennedy assassination and really give a kind of before and after, showing Jackie before the assassination and after. It gives a narrative. So there's a kind of rise and fall, or there's a kind of like there's a celebratory aspect, an affirmative aspect, and then there's the entropic aspect. And the same goes for Liz Taylor. He made the Liz Taylor paintings at a time when everyone was saying, "Oh, Liz is so sick, she's going to die." And so Warhol was very interested in the way in which all of the there was always kind of a dark underbelly to to the apparent glitter and the beautifully constructed surface, as Tom calls it. And I think with these women in particular, there was a profound identification on his part. Warhol would have liked, wouldn't have minded waking up one day and being someone like Marilyn Monroe. He identified with them, I think, as a homosexual because not just because they were women and and they loved men like him, but also because of their problems with men. Warhol's favorite phrase for saying that someone was gay was not to say, "Oh, he's gay." He would say, "Oh, he has a problem." And so I think it relates to Warhol's desire to to get away from himself. There was a constant sort of, I think, a movement away from his dissatisfaction with his physicality, with an awareness of his low status in the social food chain, but also an idea that somehow through attaching himself to these images that already existed, he would kind of become a mirror to them. I mean, people often speak about there's that famous song by the Velvet Underground, "I'll Be Your Mirror." And Warhol really was a true mirror of his time. You could read his work as a kind of time capsule, showing all these changes that Tom described a moment before that America was undergoing in the 60s and 70s. But it also shows that Warhol understood the dialectic of fame very well. If you want to become famous, one way to do that is to put yourself in, to make sure that you get photographed next to a lot of famous people, because then eventually everyone's going to be asking, "Well, who's that person?" In the same way, I think his paintings of Marilyn and Liz and Jackie show that a willingness, I would call it an opportunism, and I don't mean it in a bad way, but a willingness to use what was already famous instead of creating something that would then become famous. I mean, the classical romantic idea was that the artist discovers beauty and then struggles to communicate it to the world, and Warhol's attitude was more like, well, everyone already likes this. There's no reason to to struggle. Take something that's already beautiful and kind of supercharge it. His pop palette is a way of supercharging and almost overloading these images so that they communicate in almost unbearable intensity, which again I think reflects the degree of his identification with them.